Okay, can everybody hear me? I hope so. And there should be a big image up on your screen. Um, Tonight, we're going to talk about Wheels of Fortune, the story of the Miami Cycle and Manufacturing Company, which is this Middletown story that many of you might not be aware of, but it's an important story that highlights a certain period of time in Middletown's history. So here we are, Middletown, 1880. This is, as far as we know, the oldest photograph of Middletown, taken from Old South School. And I always like to start with this photograph because it's not only the oldest, but it's an interesting photo. Over here at the right-hand side is the Miami-Indy Canal, which played such an integral part in Miami or in Middletown's growth. And this is one, probably the only photograph I found from that time that shows the canal. And the story we're going to tell actually starts with Paul J. Sorg. Many of you may know Sorg from Middletown history, Sorg's Opera House, Sorg Tobacco, Sorg Paper Company. He was really instrumental in growing Middletown's industry. And not only that, but he was very generous with his money, giving back to the community, built the Opera House in 1891 just for the community. But his story starts in 1840. He was born in Wheeling, West Virginia. His family moved to Cincinnati in 1851. And in the 1860s, he entered the tobacco business. He came to Middletown in 1869 and founded the first paper company here with 4 partners. He brought with him a gentleman named John Auer, who he had met in Cincinnati, and they formed the first paper company. Auer and Sorg left that paper company a little bit later, and Wilson and McCauley, the other 2 partners, formed their own paper company or tobacco company. So here you have Auer and Sorg Tobacco. This was located on the canal at Girard. In 1877, this is an 1888 photograph, that's why I put that down there. But 1877, Paul J. Sorg Tobacco Company was formed. His partner, John Auer, retired, and Sorg started the P.J. Sorg Tobacco Company. It was located on the east side of Middletown, where at that time there was hardly anything, but it was near the new railroad on the east side. In the 1880s, Middletown was the 3rd largest producer of plug tobacco in the country, if you can believe that. This area was really a productive area for growing tobacco, and lots of the farmers around here had that as part of their crops. And so it was very big industry for Middletown at that time, actually Middletown's first big industry. At Sorg, P.J. Sorg Tobacco Company at the time, there were 700 employees. So it was a large outfit. And they made several brands, produced several brands of plug tobacco, which was chewing tobacco. In 1898, the Paul J Sorg Tobacco Company was bought out by the Continental Tobacco Company, which later became American Tobacco Company. And that was all a part of the trust movement that was going on in the country at that time. Companies buying up other companies and forming huge trusts. And so this Continental Tobacco Company bought out P.J. Sorg's Tobacco Company. They kept one of the buildings there as the P.J. Sorg division, and you can see this sticker, which was on part of the packages, P.J. Sorg Company. And at that time, around that same time, Paul Sorg and the Businessmen's Club here in Middletown, this is Sorg right here in the middle, they were always looking for new industry. And one of the things they found was a company in Dayton, Ohio, called the McSherry Company. In 1892, excuse me, there was a Sorg and Jacoby proposal, you can see up here in the newspaper, to bring this company from Dayton to Middletown. And there was a building already, but they were going to expand that building, add on to it. And this would be a new company for Middletown. The company McSherry made farm implements. And that was also a big industry around the area. If you study anything from Hamilton industry, you know that they had several big farm implement companies down there at the same time. And so in 1883, the building was underway, and they were expanding the operation, and they were able to bring the McSherry Works to Middletown. This is the building that it actually became later on. As you can see McSherry there. They had 300 employees. It was located on Grand Avenue, which is a little misleading because Grand Avenue, where this railroad track, does not go through there anymore. When the thoroughfares were created, Grand Avenue stopped before it continued on. But originally it was it was located on Grand Avenue. Now back to tobacco for a minute. Part of what the companies did at the time, this goes back to Sorg before he was bought out, but the American Tobacco Company here, you see premium certificate. They offered certificates that were put into the package or attached to the package, I say, of plug tobacco. And if you filled this out and sent it in with enough copies of the premiums, you were eligible for one of the things that they had in their catalog, several different items that you could choose. This is what the catalog from American Tobacco looked like in 1895. And one of the things that they found that was the most successful were bicycles. This was about the time that the bicycle was had really taken off. And if you sent in so many premiums, I don't know what the number was, but if you sent in so many premiums, you were eligible to receive a bicycle. Well, the demand was just tremendous. And so around that time, the McSherry Works up on the fourth floor began to produce bicycles, 1894. But this demand continued, and we're going to see how that played out in Middletown. But first we need to jump to the evolution of the bicycle real quickly. Up here in the upper left-hand corner, you see the Dracine 1817. This was a vehicle that kind of reminds me of a skateboard because you had no pedal or anything, but if you got up enough steam, you could jump on and coast for a while. But you can see this guy running along here. And then next was the Treadle Bicycle. This was the forerunner of the pedal bicycle. And here are the treadles that they controlled the back wheel. And the original pedal bicycle, 1866, was developed. Doesn't look real comfortable to me, but here are the pedals on the front wheels. Later on, you had the huge velocipede bicycle, and it was also called the bone shaker because of course, the roads at that time were terrible, and it was very difficult to have a smooth ride on these roads. The high wheeler, also you can see here, was very popular at that time, 1860s and 1870s. I've always wondered what the thinking behind the high wheeler was, because it's if you've ever seen anybody try to get on one of these, it's very difficult. I remember a couple American Pickers shows where Mike Wolf has learned to ride one of these. He just climbs right up on it and gets going, and with no trouble at all. But I don't think I'd want to try it. 1885, we finally had the safety bicycle, and this was the immediate forerunner of the bicycle that we know today, where you had two equal-sized wheels. Now these aren't exactly equal, but and the pedal with the crank, and that was safety bicycle. So 1885 that was developed, and of course by the 1990s there was a bicycle craze not only in America but across the world. This was a portable way of getting around, and it was very, very popular. The bicycle really didn't cost that much money for most people, and it really provided an easy way to get around. So in 1895, July 20th, a new company was formed in Middletown, the Miami Cycle and Manufacturing Company. And it was formed specifically to meet the demand of these bicycles that were coming in through the tobacco premiums. Very popular, and it was formed with $50,000 capital, probably mostly from Paul J Sorg. And here is the first president of Miami Cycle. Sorg had a partner in some other ventures, like the American Tobacco Company. And this was Colonel Frank Ray. He was the first president of Miami Cycle. He was a New York financier. He was into railroads, mining, dam building, all kinds of great big projects. And he became a partner of Sorg and Sorg Tobacco. And then, of course, later headed up the company, Miami Cycle. They saw the potential of bicycles. And that's the reason that they formed this company. And you can see the very first bicycle that they produced, and the most popular one over the years, was the Racycle, of course, named after Colonel Ray. And one of the main features of this is this big crank wheel. This was much larger than a normal bicycle, and really allowed for extra speed and
I'm in a meeting, sorry.
hello. Anyway, In 1895, August the 28th, you see the paper here, the Middletown Signal paper. The Miami Cycle Company got an order for 35,000 Racycles from the J Sorg Tobacco Company. And that was specifically to meet this demand for bicycles through the premium program. So by this time, the company is just, brand new, but already they have, by the end of the year, 1895, they have 30 traveling salesmen and 1,500 agents in every state in the Union. So this is immediately a big concern for Middletown and, quite successful. 1896, the Racycle, the Miami Cycle Company had the first Racycle meet, and it was organized as a 15-mile race, starting in Middletown and ending up back in Middletown. And there were several races associated with it for different age groups throughout the day. So the Racycle was really gaining popularity and was part of different events that Middletown was able to stage. And here we have the Middletown Signal newspaper, March 5th, 1897. And there's an article about women discussing organizing a new Racycle club to do their own racing. What they're talking about in this article is, what should we wear? And of course, they mentioned the bloomer, which had just gotten popularity, and that this might be something that would be successful for them to wear when they were what they called wheeling. Bicycles, they would refer to them as bicycles sometimes, and they would refer to them as wheels or wheeling just as often. And here later on in one of the back pages of this edition was an ad for the Racycle. And this is the earliest ad that I was able to find, 1897. And they're talking about a price of $35 to $55 for the Racycle. So you can see that it was fairly inexpensive at the time. Several people in Middletown had it for sale. Jacoby Hardware here was a big firm that we'll see later on that had that carried the Racycle. And 1901, this Racycle is really at the peak of production. June 5th, there's a huge ad, front page of the Daily Signal, and here's Jacoby Hardware again. Right away, the company started to advertise. They realized the value of advertising. But here's an interior shot of some guys producing the wheels. At that time, when the Racycle was at its peak, there were 300 employees at the company. All the machinery was run by electric, and there were 5 freight lines, railroad freight lines, that came into the company. At that time, more Racycles were sold than any other high-grade US bike. There were many bicycle manufacturers by the turn of the century, but there were a few that were recognized as really high quality. And the Racycle was right up there, and it was the biggest seller. So in 1904, the Racycle was the only bicycle to win a grand prize at the St. Louis World's Fair. And here's an article in the paper about that. Here's a shot of the fair, which was huge, and the medal that they received. And also, here's an ad capitalizing on that prize. Here's some shots of the facilities for the company. This is kind of the overall shot. Says home of the Racycle, Miami Cycle Manufacturing Company.
Okay.
Interior shots, sales and advertising, the managers in the main office, and then that down here is the brazing department. It was a very big industry by that time, and very good for Middletown. At that time, there was still the tobacco company, there were paper companies, and this huge bicycle company. And as I mentioned before, they started to advertise immediately and get the name out there, the Racycle. It was also about the time that there were new magazines that were available for this growing middle class. And you could advertise pretty cheaply in these magazines. Saturday Evening Post and some of the very early ones at the turn of the century. But this gives you an idea of the some of the things that were featured in their different models that they had. But quite a range of advertising. This is the catalog from 1904. Every year they'd have a catalog of their products. And it shows already that the Racycle is popular around the world. Here's a Cuban racing club that has all Racycles. There's a store in Belgium, and Mexican Racycle agency, and very popular in Japan. Here's a Japan racing club, and their agents were stationed all around the world to help sell the Racycle and other products you'll see here in a minute. At one time, I think around this time, they had reached 100,000 bicycles, producing 100,000 bicycles a year. In 1906 to 8, they were involved in producing some new brands. Here's the Racycle, and here's the Racycle front badge that was on the front there. Also started the Hudson bicycle and the Miami bicycle. They were a little different design, and here, of course, there's some workers that were in the factory at that particular time, but they really started to branch out with different brands of bicycles. And this guy up here, the Racycle was involved in several bicycle races. And I think a large part of that was because of this crank. You could really, if you got going, you could really add some speed. Now in 1905, they made a major change. They introduced the motor Racycle. Basically, all that was adding a motor onto a Racycle bicycle. A little more complicated than that, but this model is a little later model. But here they are advertising in the Middletown Daily Signal. Again, the motor Racycle. About that time, the motorcycle was gaining in popularity. 1867, as far back as 1867, someone put a steam engine on a velocipede and created what was the first motorcycle, and it caught on very quickly. By 1884, the first commercial designs for motorcycles started to appear. And then, of course, they adopted the internal combustion engine, and that made it much more efficient. 1898, Peugeot introduced their motorcycle. Also 1898, Triumph Company. 1901, the Indian motorcycle appears. In 1903, Harley Davidson motorcycle. So really, within just a few years, some of the major companies that continued to produce motorcycles started to appear. The Miami Cycle Company was right in the middle of it. And here's some advertising for the Racycle motorcycle. They had different names for it. They weren't quite sure what to call it, but it was a very popular machine, and at the time, and caught on very quickly. 1909 to 1912 is when these advertisements were running. So this is when they were producing the Racycle motorcycle. In 1911, another major change. Miami Cycle Company purchased the Merkel Light Company out of Pottsville, Pennsylvania. They had an opportunity to buy this company, bring them to Middletown, and they had the company had a pretty successful history already. They built an addition or two additions onto the factory, and at that time there were 800 people on the payroll. So the Merkel Motor Company, actually Joseph Merkel here, started in 1903, and Joseph Merkel was born in 1872. He was interested in mechanical things at an early age, and 1901 he started his own business making bicycle parts. Eventually he attached a small motor which became the Merkel motorcycle, which you see in these advertisements here. He was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin at the time. He decided to sell the company to the Merkel Light Motor Company. The Light Motor Company bought out his company, and they were located in Pottstown, Pennsylvania. He went with the company and continued to develop motorcycles, eventually with the most famous one from that company called the Flying Merkel. And here you can see their logo, the Flying Merkel. That would become a signature bicycle for not only this company, but also the Miami Cycle Company. So in 1911, as I said before, the company bought out Merkel Light Motor Company. And Joseph Merkel stayed with the company in Middletown until he eventually sold out his interest in 1914. The Flying Merkel was known for its reliability and its front and rear suspension system. It was a little bit different from the rest of the bicycles at the time, and was really a dependable bicycle or a motorcycle for a lot of people. Then in the Flying Merkel really lasted from 1910 to 1917, and we'll get to that in a minute. Up here is Joseph Merkel. Again, he's holding some kind of a trophy. This was the racing bicycle, Flying Merkel. The handlebars are lower. It's a lower bicycle, and I don't know this guy's name, but he was one of the famous racers from that was part of the company. But now you can see that the Flying Merkel is part of the Miami Cycle and Manufacturing Company, home of the Flying Merkel. I think I have some sound here I found online of a Flying Merkel that has been restored. And this is what it sounds like as it idles. Here is the Flying Merkel. It was a very popular racing motorcycle for board tracks, which you see here, and also dirt tracks. One of the most famous riders was this gentleman right up here, Maldwin Jones. He was a famous dirt racer, born in 1891, grew up in nearby Lebanon, Ohio. And actually at the age of 18, he began racing all kinds of motorcycles. But in 1911, he came to work at the Miami Cycle Company as a test rider. They had realized that there was a market for racing motorcycles. And here again, you see the Flying Merkel, a little different configuration here, but the handlebars are lowered. And he is, I think this is on Central Avenue in Middletown. When Miami Cycle started to slow down in production and everything, Maldwin Jones went to Harley Davidson as a racer and had some success there until he retired. The Flying Merkel had other uses, and here you see some recreational motorcycles. These are all Middletown people that owned Flying Merkel motorcycles. By this time, they've got a huge headlight. And up here is what was the city building in Middletown in the early 1900s on Broad Street. In back of, anybody that's from Middletown will know, in back of where the Pendleton Art Center is where this building was located. Firehouse number 1 was there. And also you can see the police department out here. And as a part of their vehicles, they had some Flying Merkels. Here's a shot of the interior Flying Merkle section of the company and their manufacturing Flying Merkles. One of the unique features about it was this twin engine that you see here. Also, it's advertised in the Middletown papers. And let's see, we've got a price here of from $210 to $290. Be nice to be able to still get one for that price. Over here, we've got the Flying Merkle as it was outfitted for fire departments. And it's hard to see, but on the front here, were located a couple fire extinguishers. But it's you can see that the market has really expanded for this particular motorcycle. Now, about the same time, the popularity of the automobile was just taking off. Here are several ads from the Middletown Signal newspaper for some automobiles that were produced at that time. You can see that there were a number of different auto manufacturers. 3 up here that didn't make it. Maxwell was pretty popular, but I don't remember ever hearing about the Jeffrey or the Saxon 6. But these were all sold by Middletown companies, and of course this is an early auto out in front of the Harwitz house on Vanderveer Street. So the popularity of the automobile starts to cut into the market of the motorcycle. It will pick back up, but it was really starting to impact that particular industry. 1914, the Great War wasn't called World War I yet. The Great War started, and up here you see French soil is invaded by Teutons. So the Germans had invaded France, coming through the country of Belgium. When they did that, there were a lot of battles and atrocities, is the way it was explained, as the Germans moved through Belgium. Many people died. Belgium was a neutral country, but so it was overrun very easily, and this was the pathway to get to France. In Middletown, there was a real effort, and this was nationwide, really. Many people had read the accounts of these atrocities in the newspaper, and they were very sympathetic to the Belgian people. So in Middletown, there was a Belgium fund that was established. And I don't know if you can see it or not, but right here at the top, the Miami Cycle and Manufacturing Company, they were instrumental in starting the fund, and they gave donations that were at the top of the donation list. But there's several companies. This is the first ad. The fund continued on, and I don't know the totals, but it was something that was really starting to catch on. There were other funds throughout the country as the U.S. citizens felt a real affinity for the atrocities that were happening in Belgium. It was kind of inevitable that the U.S. was going to enter World War I, or the Great War, and certainly in April of 1917, can see here, Wilson declares war. Woodrow Wilson finally gave up. He had run on a campaign of, he kept us out of war, but eventually it was just inevitable that the United States was going to get involved in this war. December the 7th, 1917, right away, the Miami Cycle and Manufacturing Company got a large war order, and you can see the headline up here because the men were starting to get called up for service. They may have to put women to work. So this is a little controversial at the time, but they did hire women, and they had this huge government war contract to produce grenades. And this is actually not from the company, but this is very typical of a woman here drilling holes into what was a grenade. Because of the war production, that had a major effect on the production of motorcycles and bicycles with the company. And so in 1917, they made the decision to stop producing the Flying Merkel. They were getting so many orders for war production materials that they just could not afford to produce this famous Racycle or racing machine any longer. And a kind of a little side story, the reason that they picked this particular color of orange was really to kind of stand out from a marketing standpoint. And of course, racing. At the time, orange was not a very popular color. You didn't see many things in orange, but most of the motorcycles were either black or dark red. Blue was very popular. And here was an article in a magazine in 1912 talking about how the motorcycle success follows the use of orange. Very interesting article, and how that affected the Flying Merkel. The Miami Cycle and Manufacturing Company finally dissolved in 1923, and it was sold to a group of men who started, Middletown men who started a company called the Miami Cabinet Company. Here's the very last ad that for the Racycle and the Hudson in 1923. This appeared in the Middletown High School Optimist yearbook. But later on in 1923, the company was dissolved, and this new company was formed. It was formed specifically to manufacture cabinets for the new Manchester Hotel, which you see down here. Manchester was built in 1922, and it was very popular at the time. Middletown did not have a hotel of that size. And these gentlemen that had invested in the hotel to build the hotel, started this company specifically to manufacture cabinets out of steel for the hotel. One thing that, let me back up 1 second here and talk about the Merkel for a minute. The highest price that I have found that was paid for a Flying Merkel today was in 2015, and it very similar to this racing bike. It was a 1911 Flying Merkle board racer, and it sold for $423,000. That's the highest price that I have found so far for a racer. Most of them go for 100 to 150, probably up to $200,000 now. And every once in a while, the American pickers find one in a barn or garage someplace. And I don't think they've ever been able to buy one, but that is kind of the goal. You know, Mike Wolf is a big motorcycle fan, so he's always on the lookout for not only Harleys, but Flying Merkles. They're very hard to find. Okay, here are some ads for the Miami Cabinet Company. Later on, that became Miami Carry Company, which made all kinds of cabinetry for different uses. The Miami Cycle Company, the bicycles and the different brands were acquired by the Westfield Manufacturing Company in 1924. Westfield had been the Pope Manufacturing Company out of Boston. They had a very famous bicycle called the Columbia, and but Westfield acquired not only Miami Cycle, but several other bicycle companies at the time. And you can see they kept the Racycle brand for the faceplate there, but it's now Westfield. So this has been the story of the Miami Cycle and Manufacturing Company, located in Middletown. Their two most famous products, the Racycle bicycle and the Flying Merkle motorcycle. As I mentioned, it's a often forgotten part of Middletown's history. Didn't last very long, but a couple of decades, but very popular. And that's why I titled this The Wheels of Fortune, because the gentlemen that were involved in the company at the time were very, very successful. So I guess Ruth will turn it over to some questions.
Yes, and so can we only unmute a few mics at a time, so there's not so much feedback, but would anybody like to start asking questions?
Oh, good.
Don't make me call on people to get this ball rolling. I know somebody has a question.
Well, I guess I must have been very thorough if no one has any questions, but
I have a question. When
Oh.
did the Schwinn dealers come into Middletown?
I'm sorry?
The Schwinn dealers? When did the Schwinn dealers come into Middletown?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Let me defer to Jim Stabler. I did not grow up in Middletown. I grew up in Eaton, Ohio. But I would imagine sometime in the
50s.
late 40s, early or
Yeah.
50s.
Yeah, they were quite popular here.
Jim Stabler, do you know?
Jim Stabler does not know, but I think Huffies were really big in Middletown because they were made in Dayton.
Yeah.
That was a big deal. But I don't know when the Schwinn dealer. You talking about the one that was down on
2nd Street?
where the Coke company was?
Yeah.
That was in late 50s, early 60s, I think. I think it's
Probably. That's about
because the
time we
Coca-Cola
were-
plant, that was their bottling plant.
Oh,
And then when they closed up their bottling, then it became the Schwinn company then. It sold
yeah.
by-
And then Huffy was a big name too. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Well, if not, I will turn this back over to Ruth, but thank you all for tuning in. I hope you learned something about Middletown's history that you didn't know before, and we'll see if we can sometime down the road present another part of our local history here. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you guys
Thank you.
for attending. If you guys want to stick around and chat afterwards, I'm willing to hang out. I did launch the poll, and when we do hang out, if somebody wants to chat, I will turn off the recording, and we will not need Karen anymore to close caption.
Hey, I do have a question.
Okay.
I just finally figured out how to get unmuted.
Hi, Dave.
Where was the Miami Cycle building? I'm thinking
Well, it was down, as I said, when Grand went through before the thoroughfares were built, when Grand went all the way through, it was located, Cohen owns the property now.
okay.
There, I don't know, there is a big long building there, but I don't know whether that was a part of the original factory or not. But that's the area that it was in. If you go, like you're going out to Hamilton and you make the turn there off of University, you'll see off to the right, there's a big building, and Cohen owns that whole thing. But that's generally where the factory was located. I don't know the exact year. Jim might remember, but I was here, so it had to be after 64. There was a huge fire at the Miami Carey building, one of the biggest fires that Middletown ever had.
Mhm.
There are a lot of pictures of it online if you Google that or go to the library's website. But that fire kind of ended some of the buildings that the original bicycle and motorcycle factory were in.
Yeah, 1974, I'm pretty sure, Sam.
74, okay.
Yeah.
I
And
remember,
rumor has it, the reason it burned so fast is because it was all wood and was soaked in oil.
Yeah.
And stuff from where they were making the bikes and things.
yeah,
Yeah, it
even
was
though it was a brick building, but it pretty well destroyed the building and was not used for anything later. I think most of it was destroyed.
Sam, we do have some questions that are in the chat. The first one was, when was the bike re-engineered to make it more comfortable for women to ride it?
Well, as far as Miami Cycle goes, almost right at the beginning, they started realizing that this was a mode of transportation for women as well as men, and so they devised a bike, an offshoot of the Racycle for women. That's very similar to what women's bicycles look like today. Well, generally what we've thought of that, but so they were right at the beginning. As far as other manufacturers, I don't really know, but as I said, it kind of came along at this interesting time in women's history that where they were starting to, it coincided with the suffrage movement also, that women were starting to assert themselves a little bit more. And we, deciding that we want to be a part of this. So what are we going to wear? Well, the bloomer was the big popular thing at the time for certain women, and it was perfect for riding a bicycle. So they kind of happened at the same time.
Okay, Sam, you might not know this, but the next question is, what is the gear ratio of the Racycle?
I was afraid somebody was really going to get technical on me. I don't know, but I can sure find out. I think there is some information online. There actually is a lot of information about both the Racycle and the Flying Merkle online. I kind of decided not to get into too much of the technical stuff, but I can find out, and if someone wants to send me an email, I'll see what I can find out.
Okay. Sam, can you share your email address with everyone real quick?
Sure. SAM41, Sam41 at cinci.rr.com.
And I'm going to send out the recording to everybody that registered because there were several people that did not attend. So I will include Sam's email address in the recording as well. We do have another question about how hard are Racycles to find. We did have a bit of conversation about what state of disrepair it might be in, but if you could answer that one.
And I didn't catch the first part of that.
How hard is it to find Racycles today?
It's very hard to find. We have one at our historical society. It received a little bit of damage. It was restored. It received a little bit of damage when we moved, and it's on my list of things to kind of write a grant for, to get that back repaired and be able to display it at our other building, at the Treadle building. But that one, I think, was found by Everett Sharon years ago. And occasionally people will find them in the hayloft of a barn or something like that, that has been long forgotten, and they can restore them and so forth. And as far as the Racycle goes, I don't know what they go for, like on eBay or something like that. That would be interesting to find out. But they are around, very kind of hard to find anymore.
Okay, and the next question is, what happened to Westfield?
Well, that's a question I don't know the answer to. Westfield, I think, if I remember seeing this online, is still in operation. They may not be making bicycles anymore, but the Westfield Manufacturing Company, I think, is still in operation in Massachusetts.
Okay, so the next question is, where were the materials sourced? Where did the materials come from to build the Racycle on the Flying Merkle?
Well, of course, this was all, the first part of it was all before Armco came to town. But after Armco came to town, there were, steel was available. And, in this area, if anybody has looked into the Miami Valley from the 1870s through to the turn of the century, and especially Hamilton and Middletown were huge industrial centers. Hamilton especially had many industrial, different kinds of industry down there, safes, paper, farm implements, and big companies, forging companies. And so it was pretty easy to get materials right here in the Midwest, right in the Miami Valley to produce. Now, when the McSherry Company started, that was a company, as I said, that made farm implements. And so they had they had the tools and everything to be able to produce these bicycles up on the fourth floor. So I don't think it was very hard to get the materials and resources to, start producing bicycles.
I do want to thank, I believe it's Lester. He has provided answers to 2 of our questions. The gear ratio depends upon the model of the bicycle. And he also looked up that Westfield is currently making school furniture and desks.
Ah,
So,
okay.
so that is what he believes it has happened. And then the next question, I'm trying to go through the feed, sorry.
Okay.
How were flying marshals used during the war?
They weren't specifically used, shipped overseas to be used. There, I forget what I ran into, but it might have been Harleys at that time, were used by some of the troops in World War I. But the company, when they received that huge order of for grenades, hand grenades, basically had to shut down, had to make a decision about shutting down the production of the Flying Merkel, because it just wasn't profitable to keep producing that during the wartime. And of course, nobody knew how long the war was going to last, and what resources were going to have to be put into the war effort. And so they shut it down. I have not found any evidence that Flying Merkels, which was basically a racing motorcycle. The first version of it was popular for recreation and so forth, but that one version that they eventually were just producing was a racing motorcycle. So I haven't found any evidence that it was something that was shipped over for use of the troops in World War I.
Okay, I have no questions left in the chat. This is the last call for you to unmute your mic or chat in a question. I feel like we need the Vanna White timer here. Da, 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 da.
Well, I can see little thumbnails of a lot of people, and so it's good to see you all. Thank you all for participating, and I'm sure Ruth will contact me about something else, and we'll see if we can do another one of these at some time in the future. Thanks again, really appreciate it.
Thank you.